Good morning. It's Wednesday, September 17th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 712 days old. I'm your host, Natalie Ecanow, back at it again while Jonathan Schanzer saves the world. Welcome back to the FDD Morning Brief. Today's guest is FDD's very own David Adesnik. David, who serves as VP of Research at Our Little Shop, has been closely tracking those Gaza famine claims that have been spreading like wildfire. Turns out, and no surprise there, the F word being used to describe the situation in the Gaza Strip is a lot more complicated than the headlines like to flash. He'll be joining the program shortly to help us dissect the on-the-ground realities in the strips, particularly in relation to food security. So stay tuned. Ferris Bueller once said that life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it. Of course, Mr. Bueller was talking about coming of age in Chicago, but he may as well have been talking about the Middle East in September 2025. Things in the region are moving a mile a minute these days. Leaders from dozens of Arab and Islamic countries flocked to Qatar on Monday for an emergency summit. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio landed in Qatar yesterday after spending the weekend in Israel. As he touched down in Doha, the IDF began its long-anticipated ground incursion into Gaza City. Oh, did I mention that the anniversaries of the Abraham Accords and the murder of Mahsa Amini by Iran's morality police, which sparked the 2022 Women Life Freedom protests in Iran, were this week? There's lots going on and lots to unpack, so let's dive in, starting with your headlines. Headline 1. The Treasury Department rolled out a fresh batch of Iran sanctions. The latest package targets a financial network that supports Iran's military. Treasury slapped sanctions on 2 Iranian financial facilitators, as well as over a dozen other individuals and entities based far and wide in places like Hong Kong and the United Arab Emirates. The targets are part of what Treasury calls a shadow banking network. Each one plays a role in helping Tehran evade sanctions and rake in cash to fund its terrorist proxies and develop advanced weapons. Of course, Tehran wields those proxies and those weapons to target Israel, U.S. forces, and those of our allies, which is why the Trump administration is committed to draining Iran's coffers. Keep it coming. Headline 2. Let's talk about that emergency summit that Qatar hosted on Monday. In response to Israel's strike against Hamas leaders in Doha, representatives from nearly 60 Arab and Islamic countries convened in Qatar to lash out at Israel. To craft a unified response to the Israeli strike. The group issued a nothing burger of a joint statement that urged states to punish Israel, but didn't actually outline any tangible steps that governments might take. The statement called for legal proceedings and for countries to review diplomatic and economic relations with Israel. It's all run-of-the-mill anti-Israel stuff. Here's what's interesting, especially for the history buffs in our audience. The summit took place on the 5th anniversary of the Abraham Accords. I'm talking 5 years to the day. The leaders of the Abraham Accords countries were noticeably absent from Monday's summit. That's right, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco sent senior representatives instead. Headline 3. Israel carried out strikes against Yemen's Hodeidah port. Hodeidah is controlled by the Houthis and is a key part of the rebel supply chain. Yesterday, the IDF issued an evacuation warning for the area before launching strikes against military infrastructure at the port. Houthi spokesman Yahya Saree claimed that the group's air defenses engaged Israeli aircraft and, quote, caused great confusion, end quote. According to Houthi media, the IDF Hodeidah's docks at least 12 times. Sources on the ground said that the strikes lasted approximately 10 minutes and hit infrastructure that had been restored after sustaining damage in previous Israeli attacks. Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz vowed to keep on striking the Houthis so long as the Houthis keep on lobbing drones and missiles at Israel. And bonus headline 4, the United Nations says Israel is committing a genocide. Shocked? I'm not. Yesterday, the so-called UN Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory and Israel published a 70-plus page report that claimed Israeli activity in Gaza amounts to genocide. It's no secret that the UN is rabidly anti-Israel, but this is actually the first time that the Commission has determined Israel is committing genocide. In previous reports, the Commission of Inquiry accused Israel of war crimes and crimes against humanity, but stopped short of using the G word. Now, the Commission itself doesn't have the power to actually do anything, but that doesn't mean its words don't have weight. I'd venture to guess that the International Criminal Court will take the Commission's findings seriously as it weighs South Africa's genocide case against Israel. And that, folks, is bad news. All right, it's time for my interview with David Adesnik. Without further ado, let's welcome him onto the program. Welcome to the program, David Adesnik.
Always a pleasure to be here.
So I want to start by talking about the situation, the humanitarian situation in Gaza, particularly regarding food insecurity. Can you explain how your research approaches the debate over the famine declarations there?
Sure. To give you a broad picture, of course, Gaza is not a place that any American would want to be right now, or anyone living in a developed country. Very few people, except perhaps those connected to Hamas, are doing well. The daily effort often focuses on just finding enough food. But the question is, as you said, where are we in relation to the F word? And that was a declaration on August 22nd. An international group known as the IPC, using their formal criteria, declared there was a famine. So in my research, right, I dive into the IPC documentation. They have a special review committee that put out a report of about 50 pages. And then I will show you that just 3 weeks after that came out, the Israeli government produced this, a 60-page response. The coverage of the two has been a little imbalanced. There was a lot of headlines about the declaration of famine, very few about many of the methodological flaws the Israelis pointed out there. And, you know, I've been tracking these reports from the IPC that come out on a quarterly basis for over a year. Perhaps many viewers recall that there was a warning of, quote, imminent famine that came in March 2024. The famine turned out not to be imminent. They said it would materialize by the end of May. It never did. The numbers kept on improving, even by the IPC's own measures. They claim that's because people took their warning seriously. The Israelis countered that even before the IPC made their forecast, things were improving pretty dramatically because of Israeli cooperation with the UN to get more aid in. So that's the lay of the land.
Cool. So I want to touch on the IPC, or Integrated Food Security Phase classification, that you mentioned a few times there. So the IPC declarations have shaped global headlines, even legal cases against Israel. But can you unpack what the key flaws in how that famine determination was reached are?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, I dare anyone to say integrated food security phase classification 5 times fast. You won't do it, at least not get it right. It's not well known because you could barely even find who is in the organization. If you go to its website, they have some regional representatives. They have a famine review committee. They literally have an address in Rome, but you don't know who's there. So they publish detailed manuals on how they do this. This is an organization backed by several UN agencies, by the national aid agencies of a number of countries in the EU, the equivalents of our own USAID. And, in simplest terms, there are 3 criteria for declaring a famine. And the reason this distinction is so important, because you'll hear people talk about hunger, about starvation, etc. When they say famine, they mean that a very large number of people are dying every day because of hunger, because they don't have enough food, or because they are so weakened from hunger that they fall prey to disease. For that number to be reached, it would be something like 700 to 800 people dying per day in all of Gaza, or if they declared famine in just a part, as they did last month, it would still be a couple hundred. So even if you're not following the headlines, you may realize that's not happening. If hundreds of people were literally dying every day, you would hear about it. We hear about some very high-profile cases. One of the most was when the New York Times published a heartbreaking photo of a child really that had wasted away to skin and bones. The reason that was problematic is they chose someone with a congenital condition who, unfortunately, there's a set of children who are much more weakened. They need special nutrition and care, and because of the war, they're not getting it. And dozens of them have, in fact, passed away, which is terrible. But we have to keep our eyes on the definition of what it means. Is there a lack of food so dramatic that people are literally dying by the hundreds per day? And the answer is not even close. It's orders of magnitude off, even by the count offered by the Gaza Ministry of Health. So just to very quickly tick off the 3 criteria they have. One is a certain threshold in surveys of people talking about their own food deprivation. The second has to do with crossing a certain threshold of children experiencing malnutrition. And the third, the most direct measure, is just literally how many people are dying of hunger each day.
Okay, so you point to this sort of distinction and difference between the criteria for declaring a famine, the narrative that's coming out from the IPC and other organizations, and then the actual evidence on the ground. Why do you think so much of the reporting has sort of glossed over that difference? And why does that difference matter in political discourse and in the media?
Well, I think what you see is that in covering Gaza, the approach of most reporters is they instinctively have much more trust, probably most of all in non-governmental organizations and then in multilateral organizations. They heavily discount anything coming from the Israelis. On Hamas, they have a mixed record. After the New York Times falsely reported an Israeli bombing of Al-Ali Hospital in the first days of the war, they ran an editorial note saying they needed to learn to be more skeptical of Hamas claims. I'm not sure how much progress they've made. But the bottom line is it's really, people don't appreciate it so much, that it's really a lot of the humanitarian organizations that are treated as the actors with most credibility. And something like the IPC, which has, a technical manual of hundreds of pages, publishes very detailed assessments, full of numbers, full of diagrams. Its work isn't really questioned. You're really not seeing reporters dive in and examine it critically. It fits, I think, with what their pre-existing narrative is. They focus a lot on the stories of the greatest suffering, and this organization reinforces that. The data doesn't all the time, however.
So to zoom out a little bit, what are the implications of these starvation claims, like globally on the international stage, particularly with respect to Israel, and also to the United States' ability to advocate for Israel, which is our closest ally in the Middle East?
Sure. One of the most important implications is that, see, a light just went off because I'm not moving enough in my office, apparently. So there we go. So if you look at the genocide case against Israel that South Africa has brought at the ICJ, and the war crimes case brought against Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant at the ICC, it may surprise a lot of people to hear it's not about bombing, it's not about shooting. The main claims in both of those cases is that Israel practices deliberate starvation of the Gaza population. It's somewhat peculiar in the sense you can go to a dashboard set up by the Israeli entity known as Kogat, which monitors every truck entering Gaza. It's just a public website. We can probably post the URL in the show notes. And you can see that they've facilitated more than 2 million tons of aid, and I forgot how many tens of thousands of trucks entering Gaza. And in fact, at the moment, the number of trucks entering is relatively high compared to the nearly 2 years of the war, as are the monthly totals of the amount of aid going in. Nevertheless, they have chosen this avenue to pursue a legal case against Israel. And I think many people who want to see Israel sort of put up against the wall in those legal forums believe that a famine declaration is essential to it, right? If you want to prove there's deliberate starvation, at a minimum, you have to prove that the starvation isn't actually happening. If no one is actually the victim of starvation, it's hard to say it's deliberate. So this is a key part. And of course, the IPC doesn't explicitly say who is to blame, but all of its language is clearly pointed at Israel. Everything is about, are there too many restrictions, are aid getting into Gaza? They don't take up the question, is the aid that gets into Gaza being distributed competently? A pretty important point, because amazingly, and I guess I have to give the United Nations some credit for transparency, they have their own dashboard online, which tells you how many trucks are going in and how many make it to their destination. Since May 19th, which is 4 months now, they acknowledge 6 out of every 7 trucks are intercepted, sometimes by just groups of people. They call that self-distribution, although it's hard to know how organized or disorganized they are, or interdiction by armed individuals. It's sort of baffling. They keep sending in truck after truck with aid, even when 6 out of 7 are looted of that aid before they get to their destination. In contrast, that doesn't happen with the Gaza Humanitarian Fund sites that the Gaza Humanitarian Fund, the organization working in partnership with Israel, has set up further to the south in Gaza. So that's where the legal things really come into play.
Can we touch on the aid trucks for a minute? So you mentioned that a majority of the trucks that enter Gaza don't actually reach their intended destinations. How should we be thinking about the ways in which humanitarian aid is distributed or obstructed? And why is that obstruction part of the story often minimized?
Well, what we've had for several months, although it's not as loud at the moment, is this conflict between the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation and the UN and the NGOs. For months, they weren't just saying, we're not happy with you, we don't want a competitor. It was, you are literally killing Palestinians. I mean, an organization that was distributing food, it's distributed more than 2 million packages. Those are sort of packages to sustain a family for a week. So in terms of meals, we're now looking at about 150 million meals delivered through that mechanism, was constantly being dismissed as, the handmaiden of genocide. Really a surprising language, no cooperation. And it had a certain if you live in glass house element to it, because while the UN is allowing 6 of 7 trucks to be looted, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is actually getting things to its delivery points.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
I was just going to ask one last, more forward-looking question. So given the highly politicized environment today, what steps can international bodies, journalists, policymakers take to ensure that the conversations surrounding the food insecurity and the humanitarian situation in Gaza are grounded in data rather than politics?
Well, I think putting more information out there is the most important thing that the governments can do. I think with journalists, it's a matter of shifting the lens of who they believe, and they've been on the ground developing their contacts. And when you talk to them, they just believe certain people and discount others. My constant advice to anyone who advises the Israeli government, I occasionally interact with military officers, COGAT personnel, you have to, they've done an improvement, right? It took a long time for them to get their dashboard online, and their statistics have achieved a measure of credibility. But it's still an uphill battle. They're fighting on a tilted guard to the alleged theft of Hamas aid. If you look in most papers, you'll see the Israeli claim that Hamas steals a large amount. They've occasionally released a video of a truck being diverted, and a declassified document that refers in passing to a certain percentage of aid being, controlled by Hamas. But a much more systematic effort. I'm not sure that the IDF, COGAT, or the GHF were ready to fight the information war on this front, or realized how tilted the playing field was. Or surprisingly, that I think if they really do commit to putting the evidence out there, they can change things.
Well, certainly hope that's true. Thank you, David Adesnik, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Always a pleasure.
Okay, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. In the Jerusalem Strategic Tribune, my colleague Ahmad Sharawi and I discuss how Qatar and Saudi Arabia are expanding their influence in Syria, both signing substantial investment agreements with Damascus's new regime. Let's be clear, though, Saudi Arabia and Qatar have different priorities, especially regarding the Muslim Brotherhood, which Qatar supports and Saudi Arabia condemns. But Syria is playing both sides to maximize financial aid and political clout. Welcome to the Middle East. Meanwhile, in the New York Post, my colleagues Rich Goldberg and Behnam Ben Taliblu examine the ongoing impact of Mahsa Amini's murder by the regime and Iran's morality police, which occurred exactly 3 years ago yesterday. Amid worsening economic crises and the humiliation over Iran's lackluster performance during the 12-day war, Iranian citizens have once again taken to the streets, with Mahsa's name still fresh on their lips. And finally, FDD's Emily de la Bruyere and Nathan Pekarsik argue in Newsweek that the Trump administration should not settle for empty promises in its reindustrialization vision. Instead, it should leverage tariff pressures to invest in and create jobs at U.S.-based production facilities. While the private sector has made lofty commitments to domestic production, the administration must ensure these promises become reality. And that's a wrap for today, folks. If you're craving more brainy content, check out X or watch the videos we post on Instagram and YouTube. And yes, you can still make that generous tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Friday. I'll be back for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. Until then, I'm Natalie Ecanow signing off for FDD.